Welcome, everybody. Welcome, everybody. It's great to be together here, and thank you so much for joining. I know it's late in the afternoon, and there may even be some alcohol somewhere following this, so always hard to compete. But I wanted to, I'm very excited about the conversation we're going to have today. There's been so much discussion over these last two, frankly, heady days of this conference, of the conversations that constitute it, around the solution space, and specifically the solution space of the failure of education and careers to connect. So much discussion of that. We all know that there's a problem. And there's been a lot of creative work that's going on into how we create solutions that bridge between them, that make more effective interplay between learning and careers. And that's right and it's good. But from all the work that we do at Burning Glass, analyzing millions of jobs and the like, we've come to realize that at some level, there's a question of whether what we're seeing is so much a failure of the solution or a failure of language. Are we really just mostly talking past each other? Are educators and employers using different vocabulary? Are we talking past each other so that the skill gap, which is very real, is something that may have less to do with all the technology we can bring to bear and more have to do with how we can align the language that is used. I'm Matt Sigelman. I'm the CEO of Burning Glass, and I'm very glad to kick us off in this conversation today. We've got some phenomenal speakers and expert speakers of people who are really working hard on these questions and have dedicated a lot of energy to doing that. I'll introduce them from, I think, left to right? Okay, yes. Ray Blackwood is the head of product management at Campus Management, which is doing a lot to bring to bear at a systems level and from a functional level the ways in which these things can connect, both for students and for faculty, and of course for institutions themselves. Casey Thorne is the director of program architecture, which is a fabulous title, by the way, at Western Governors University. And Michael Preston is the executive director of the Florida Consortium of Metropolitan Research Universities. I always have to pause when I say that because I always want to put research somewhere in the wrong sequence. Both Casey and Michael are doing fabulous work in the field right now at institutions that have realized that this is a problem we need to take seriously and doing very interesting and different sets of work to bring that alignment to bear. And Jamie Studley is the president and the CEO of the WASC Senior Colleges and Universities Consortium, which is looking at, as always, how to ensure that we have quality education. And that's not only in her current role, but in her past roles with the education department and as a college president. And really thinking hard about how we make sure that language is invested with the right sets of meaning. So very much looking forward to this discussion and to thinking about how we can get past these gaps, how we can make sure that we're not talking past one another. Now, for those of you who were in the room for the last session, I was actually quite inspired by the jousting that was happening on stage. I don't know if we'll have the same kind of fireworks or not, but I'm a big believer in the sort of the Khrushchev school of panel management. So if you want to get my attention, just take off your shoe and start pounding. You know, Michael, I'd like to actually start with you. Okay. As we talk about this. What I'd like to do, by the way, is to sort of really divide our discussion into three core chunks. The first is to really look at where we are today and how this failure of language manifests itself. In what ways are we talking past one another, and what happens or doesn't happen as a result. We'll then switch some of our conversation to look at how we affect change to that, and what are some of the very real-world projects and initiatives that are going on today to affect that change. And finally, we'll look at what happens in that happy state where we actually are all speaking the same language. So Michael, going back to you here, when we were talking in advance of the panel, you told me a really great story about how students and faculty and employers can all have very different perceptions, even of a single word. I think that word was sales, and I'd love for you to share that with all of us here today.
Sure. One of the early iterations of what we do in the Florida Consortium, which is a joint endeavor between the University of Central Florida, University of South Florida, and Florida International University. And we represent about 180,000 students, and of course in the 3 largest cities in Florida, was we did a survey of our students of their self-reflection of how well they believe that they have the types of skills necessary to go into the workforce. And we used the NACE, the National Association of Colleges and Employers, skills desired by employers, as that kind of baseline skill set. So there's about 10 skills that they publish every year that are the most valued by employers, or at least according to their survey. And the one that we got back where our students were the least confident in their ability to actually go out and reproduce that skill in the workplaces with the term sales. Sales came in at number 8 that particular year, and students at a very low level said that they felt comfortable in sales. And then we did the thing that we always do in higher education. We started to dig a little deeper, and we found that for most students, what they understood sales to mean is selling a car, selling clothes, selling insurance, whatever it might be. And they're like, I don't want to get into sales. That's why I got into college, so I didn't have to get into sales. And we then had to reframe that for our students and let them know that sales in this context actually meant selling of ideas, selling of concepts, and that's what the employers actually were meaning in the terms of that kind of back and forth. And so with that in mind, once we reframed that for our students, their level of confidence started to rise, and they were able to articulate that better. But then again, we started to think maybe there's a better word for sales whenever we start talking to our students. And so now we're kind of jockeying around with that, and depending on the kind of whatever the group is, we start to reframe that word and make it a little bit more palatable for them.
I think it's such a great illustration of how, and there's a place where it's not even so much that we're using different languages, but to your point, where we can use the same language and it can be weighted in so many different ways and cause mistaken impressions. Ray, as you've talked about other kinds of places where language can cause real disparities, and one of the words that you said likewise can have so many different meanings in different communities is the word outcomes.
Yeah.
And that really, as we've discussed it, you've pointed out how that holds us back, and I'm wondering if you can talk about what outcomes mean to different folks and why that's a problem.
Right. So at our core, we make student information systems, and so we're very heavily involved with the registrar's office and understanding all of the different ways that you set up programs and you set up courses. And higher education is very, very focused on outcomes and mission-driven programs. And when we start to talk about skills and employability skills, they're like, oh, well, we already have our outcomes. But really, they're not the same thing. The learning outcomes, the ability to synthesize ideas, the ability to demonstrate proficiency and understanding is not the same thing as tangible skills that allow students to be effective doers in the workplace. And I think helping colleges and universities understand that, yes, outcomes for programs and accreditation, all this is very, very important, but there's a different dimension to those outcomes, and those are, what are the outcomes that relate to things that a student can do once they leave and once they graduate and start entering the workforce.
Jamie, let me put that to you. Yeah. I'm sure you have some perspectives on that, and specifically, I'm keen to get your sense of whether what Ray is describing and what Michael's described is a cultural difference between the academy and the world of employment, and how do we affect a translation in ways that make sense?
I think cultural difference may be a reasonable way to describe it. There are some very visceral beliefs that the academy is grounded in and that can translate but must be eventually actively translated. I'm thinking about the notion that the scope of education's purpose is enduring and broad. Enduring core competencies, adaptability. We're not thinking just about your first job. I can remember the president of the College of Worcester saying, I don't care what your first job is, I'm thinking about 10 years out. Today he would be. And they're thinking about rewards that are both tangible and intangible. So a simple notion like outcomes, clearly student learning outcomes, which was an advance to even ask higher education to articulate their outcomes, and that was a big threshold to cross not that many years ago. Now people are asking, tell me about the outcomes beyond your shores. What happens later? And can a student use those learnings in an applied way or to grow or build something? Or can they do it to meet certain needs that come after what we have evaluated and what they're doing? And I think there are ways that we can respect all those and make them useful, but we have to be attentive to the different ways that the cultures speak about them, or we'll talk past each other.
Casey, I'm curious, Western Governors has done just phenomenal work throughout its history. And it's an institution that in some ways is it may be different in that it's constructed from the ground up to be online. And it's constructed as a learning and teaching university, perhaps more than a research university at its core and soul. And some of what we hear, and we've, again, a lot of discussion through this conference around the promise of online education. And one of those promises has been that it's supposed to sort of smooth out those edges. But, I'm curious how, nonetheless, some of these problems continue to manifest even in a ground-up online environment like WGU.
So I think the point that you made earlier about the skills gap, which is a real thing, but I think there's two things that contribute to it highly. I think a lot of it's real. Some of it is due to an awareness gap, and some of it is due to a translation gap. So the first being an awareness gap for students not understanding how the learning experiences that they are engaging in are actually building tangible skills along the way. They are not great at seeing that transparently or articulating that. We need to help surface that to them. So I think there's a piece of that. There's also a translation problem between employers, higher ed, students. And when we use generic skills terms like communication or data analysis, there's a lot of gradation between what it means to be proficient in those areas. And so I think we have to, together we're better. Employers, higher ed, students, working together to close that gap, to work together and talk about, what do you mean when you say you need data analytics in this job posting for this particular role, and what level of proficiency does a student need in that? And really getting to that foundation that we then can use to say to students, hey, let's make it clear. In this learning experience that you just had, here's some tangible skills that you've learned, and these are how that you're demonstrating them. And then they have more language, and they're better equipped to be able to put that on their resume, speak to employers about what they've walked away from during their education outside of just a degree or the completion of a course, but the tangible skills that they have as well.
I love that framing of the two gaps, of an awareness gap and how language drives an awareness gap and how it also drives this translation gap. And I think translation gap is a wonderful summary of some of what we'll talk about. And it's also a great segue in a way into where I hope we'll go next, which is really looking, so I don't want to be one of these panels that spends its time documenting the problem. All four of you are doing really meaningful work and putting meaningful thought toward how to bridge this translation gap. And so I'd like us to look at some of that work right now and thought that's going into this problem. Jamie, I want to start with you as we think about bridging the translation gap. Are there effective ways to translate between academic lingo and a language that can bridge higher ed and workplace readiness?
Okay. I came up with three in answer to that question. Really briefly, one of the assumptions that has been made, and I don't want to use too broad a brush, but by some education institutions or some people, is that education is what happens in a classroom or explicit learning dynamic with a faculty member. And I think we undervalue the co-curriculum as a place to do that bridging, to demonstrate the application of the skills and competencies in a way that can take you right to the workplace, the leadership, the budget analysis, the bringing people together across differences to accomplish something that you can point to and learn both by the successes and failures. So that's one way that we can, I think the co-curriculum can be that kind of a bridge in a really practical way. Another is I can just hear a number of faculty members saying, as I read some of the Burning Glass reports, whoa, wait a minute, it's not our job to teach 20 software packages to every student. So I'm thinking about a list that's in a report that they did. Here are some great last mile skills and tools that would help people get jobs. And I could hear the blowback pretty clearly. My answer, my bridge, would be, if a student knows that she is really skilled at statistics or Python, then she can relax and study what she wants to master and the things that she wants to use to go into the kind of work that she will be able to get because she has one of those entry or last mile competencies. So in each case, it's a not either or kind of situation. I'm thinking of a panel that I went to earlier today here where they made some really good comments. One of the speakers, Tom Reddy, whom I had not known before, said, we get graduates who can make great charts, but they don't know what the question is that they're trying to answer. And I think that I know loads of faculty and institutions who would say, whoa, that's what we are trying to give them. So somebody does have to teach them the charts, and somebody does have to help them identify the question or the big picture issue. That helpful as some
that's
bridging
great.
ideas?
I particularly like this point of in some ways, not only how we can balance between the two, but you articulated really well this idea of a scaffold, right? That this isn't necessarily about changing the heart of education. It's about being able to drive articulation of value in ways that speak not only to immediate value, but to more timeless value as well.
Can I just say one thing? It's also getting beyond the first almost knee-jerk reaction. If what you hear is, you're not sending me people who can do what I need, and somebody on the academic side is saying, not my job, then you're going to get further and further apart. If you can keep in the conversation and so, wait a minute, well, I could do this, or no, I think we're saying the same thing, or then you can get to creating a scaffold. You can't if people just drive outward.
Casey, I know we've been privileged to work together on some ways that Western governors have been attacking this problem, and specifically of how to both better articulate the value of the excellent quality of curriculum that's there, and also how to identify where the blind spots are. And I'm hoping you can share with the group a little bit about what Western governors have been doing in this front.
Definitely. So one of the ways that we're tackling both the awareness and translation gap is through really reverse engineering some of the programs that we have and looking at labor market analyses to tell us what the high demand skills are that employers are looking for, and then from that point, mapping those back onto our academic programs to see where we have gaps. But it can't just stop there, because the keywords are great and they give you signals to be able to talk to each other, but it doesn't fill in the gaps. So those gaps that we need to fill in then are to engage with employers and have those conversations about the skills that they're saying students are lacking and are not prepared with. What do they actually mean? And what level of proficiency do you need of the students in that particular skill area? So basically what we're doing is using that labor market analysis, the employer feedback, to create a comprehensive network of skills, a massive skills map that we want to build and create the relationships between those skills and engage with employers so that we can all start talking the same language about what they need, what our students need, and then we can signal to students on how to talk to employers about the skills that they've left with. But the other thing that really helps us do is if we have that underlying skills framework, to your point, students really should be able to bring in skills no matter where they have earned them. Yeah. Whether it's with WGU, whether it is on the job, whether it's with another institution, and having that skills mapping and that more granular layer that we can then map students into our degree programs with is huge, because the world is changing. It's changing very quickly, and skills can be obtained anywhere, and we want to make sure that we're capturing that and have ways to give students credit and on-ramps into our degrees with it.
Yeah, it's a fabulous point. When you think about the just hours and hours of time that institutions spent negotiating credit articulation agreements and the like, and when you think about, hey, if all these courses were mapped to the same vocabulary, all of a sudden it speaks the same language, and it facilitates a true lifelong learning path, which is, I think, for so many of us, we all realize the imperative of facilitating that and removing friction from that system.
Right.
You know, one of the things as you talk about this skill map, Casey, that I think is so powerful and that I've seen from our work together is how you're bringing together not only the outside view of skills, but the inside view, and really mapping, you know, here's what employers expect of our graduates, here's what we're teaching, and where do they align, and where are there things that we need to continue to build.
Right. And if I may, Western Governors is well positioned to be able to do this, right? But no matter where you are, what higher ed institution you are a part of, this is something that everybody can do. If you take a deliberate look at the curriculum that you have prepared and pay close attention to how that curriculum is supporting those discrete skills for students, and then let them know. I mean, really help socialize that with your students. It's doable for anybody at your scale.
And I think everyone includes as well a breadth of constituencies. And Michael, you know, I know the Florida Consortium and its respective universities. By the way, for those of you who aren't familiar with the Florida Consortium of Metropolitan Research Universities, it is a consortium of USF, UCF, and FIU, maybe better known in those terms. But a lot of the work that you've been leading and your team's been leading has really been about bringing faculty into this process. To Jamie's point before, faculty are often left out of the conversation. Right. They're put as the problem in the conversation. You've been working really hard to make faculty part of the conversation, and not just part of the conversation, but part of the solution. Tell us about that work.
Absolutely. Before I get to that, the co-curricular is so important. I absolutely agree. I was a student affairs administrator specializing in student activities and engagement for 20 years beforehand, so we definitely saw the power of that as part of why I came to this job. And then also off-campus and on-campus jobs are really important too as well. We tend to discount that off-campus job and try and advise students not to do it. And then we find out in many cases that's one of the most powerful experiences that they have, especially for working students who have to pay the bills. But in our case, we found out very quickly in the consortium, we started doing some work in this area and found that, quite frankly, the left out folks are the very faculty that are teaching the classes, and the people that have absolute 100% contact with our students. Every other opportunity on campus is optional. You can avoid going into the student activities office, the career services office, no matter what it is. You can't avoid going to class or attending class online or interacting with a faculty member in some way. So we started on kind of a three-tiered, almost a three-layer cake there, where first thing we did is we joined the Florida Chamber of Commerce at the trustee level. And I wanted to hear what the conversation was at the state level, and we started playing some road games, essentially, coming off campus, going to where employers are and where they're talking about us without us in the room. And it was amazing. It was almost like, Jane Goodall or something, going into the wilderness, and listening, because eventually they forgot that I was there. So they just start talking about how higher ed is not doing their job, and they're using bad information in order to communicate that. So we went back and used platforms like Burning Glass to build some modeling, and then took it back to those employers and started actually presenting them with real data. Started to change the conversation at the state level. So that was the first level. And the second level, we started to get employers and faculty to mix it up face to face. And that's where we really started to see some real advantages. And we've done this a lot in the pilot level, but we think that this can be really scaled. And that is, if we can get faculty and employers in the same room, and not employers in the sense of the HR directors and the CEOs, but the people that are doing the work and are recommending folks for hire. So the practitioners getting together, they start, wrestling a little bit and figuring out exactly where each other's coming from. If we wanted to just talk about words or being words, we get out of the thesaurus and just compare the two and start mashing them up. I mean, that's easy enough. We're all smart here to do that. But that's not the problem. The problem was the way that we were communicating. Two things really came out of it. Faculty started to engage the employers and say, why don't you come into our classroom and actually provide content? And that's real world applicable content. Doesn't always have to be an internship. It could be project-based learning that where students can actually see where their skills are working in the quote unquote real world. And then on the other side, employers started hearing from faculty and they started hearing the fact that, look, we can't always change the nomenclature. We can't always change the outcomes in terms of learning, because we have our own people we have to be responsible to. And that's to maintain our accreditation and to maintain our standards and to understand that these are people that we have, we got to maintain a university, and that's a different beast than being just a workforce training unit. So that really worked. The third level that we have started to work on now is we take all of that data and information and we're challenging our faculty to reconsider their curriculum and start to retool it, not rewrite their total curriculum, but think about it in a different way. University of South Florida has done a great job with that. Their College of Arts and Sciences just redid an entire curriculum review in which they started to line it up with those skills that were Burning Glass, skill sets, and then they started looking in their syllabi and matching up and seeing and making sure that the projects were right there. And some of the things that we found were really impressive, like gender and women's studies at USF is, of course, much maligned because it's a liberal arts, and we all hate that now. And what they really found is that those that are students that are coming out of that are great project managers. So if you want a great project manager, get one of those students. If you want to really research something, get a historian.
I love the example because it really speaks to kind of how do we there's been such a flight out of the liberal arts and the humanities as students try to go into degree programs that they think are a lot more practical. And in fact, we know from our data that a lot of the degree programs that look like they're the most practical turn out to have the worst outcomes. Yeah. Particularly once you leave the world of STEM. So the notion that that we can prove the enduring value through, of the humanities and liberal arts, I think, is a key part of this. Michael, you use the word a lot. I noted it down here of bring people into the same room, and I think you're absolutely right that those conversations need to take place. But Ray, you've been looking at this at a systems level. And at a product level, how we can bring to bear technology solutions to make those connections happen at scale. And so I'm wondering if you can talk to me a little bit about how systems can play a role in changing the language of the conversation?
Yeah, exactly. So for decades, we've been a student information system provider. And we've got CRM, we've got all these tools and these portals for students. And everyone's talking about, retention and pathways and how can we get the students more engaged and how can we improve retention and what kind of features can you bring forth in the student information system to do that. And when we started to look at the Burning Glass data, it was like this big aha moment where it was like, wow, what if we could help students from the time that they're looking at college and this was real passionate for me, while they're in school, have access to information that provides a realistic view of what's going on in the workforce. I'm enrolled at this college. What programs are offered? What programs am I in? The program that I'm in, what jobs and career areas can that lead to? And it's an exploration exercise to have the students be curious about what's out there. How much are the salaries that are for these different jobs? What are the different jobs that play in these different areas? What are the skills that are needed? Can I get those skills? Where can I get those skills? And so we've been able to take the data from Burning Glass and visualize that data in a way that students, and whether they're an applicant or a current student or in the career services office, look at all of their different options and then take that data back into the student information system so you can map it directly to the program, that you can map it directly to the courses. So when I'm sitting there as a student thinking about what am I going to register for in the fall semester, it's not just looking at my degree requirements and I have to have this many, math and science and electives. I'm also having the perspective of what skills am I going to learn in those classes, and then if I have this skill, what kind of opportunities does that bring me? And so for me, it's about if we can create moments where students can have a vision of themselves in the future, doing something, learning something, thinking about, oh, I could learn these skills this semester and then those skills, and then those together allow me to have this path that I can continue to explore and to learn, then we've really changed the game. And we make the mapping process part of the system. So like right there, when you're building your curriculum and you're building your catalog, we can surface all those skills directly in, like, okay, well, which one of these apply to this? So it's both the learning outcomes, the ability to, synthesize information, understand, get it back, make me a whole person, be a good critical thinker and a good communicator, but also be confident that, I've learned this skill of teamwork and collaboration, and teamwork and collaboration is one of the top skills for almost all the jobs. But when we get down to the more specific ones, what pathways does that lead me to? And it may lead to places that students never thought of before. Yeah. And that's what's really exciting.
Absolutely.
I really like the idea of giving people a vision of themselves in the future and the importance of language in affecting that vision. Casey, you've been, as we sort of move to think about what the future looks like, as more and more schools take your exhortation before of, that this is stuff that others can do. As the future looks more and more like some of the things that you've done, you can sort of share with us a little bit, as you've been deploying this Rosetta Stone, as you've mapped the whole world to the skills map, what's changed?
So I think the big thing for me is context. There is nothing more powerful for students, and I truly believe more powerful for retention for students than contextualization of their learning to something that's meaningful to them and important to them. And having an underlying skills map not only allows us to surface career insights to students and different pathways that they can take based on the skills that they're bringing in, but it also provides us the opportunity to be very intentional with the way that we are surfacing learning experiences to students through a lens in which it has meaning for them. What field are they interested in? What is the career pathway that they are after? And allowing us to really build any kind of academic programming on top of that we can contextualize for them and give them choice in their learning. So I think the big thing for me that is shifted and changed is this skills mapping really allows us to provide added context to students for career choice in their learning.
And Michael, likewise, I know as you've envisioned kind of where you talked about the different steps that you've gone through on this journey, and I know one that you're looking forward to undertaking next is around putting more course pathways and other kind of information in the hands of students.
Yeah.
kind of what do you think that opens up?
Well, I think it opens up a new frontier for students, once again, those choices that they can make, and they can build an educational journey that's their own, based on the skill sets that they want to learn, not necessarily the major that they're pursuing. And that's different. We pretend like we used to be good at this and now we are not good at it. We've never been good at this. Like if you go back and read old literature, and this is one of my nerd things that I do on the weekend, is I read old higher education journals from the 30s and 40s. They were talking about that then. And so it's not gotten any better or any worse, it just is. And so we're trying to change the is. It's no longer, stasis is no longer acceptable. We have to do this because the playing field's too big. It was okay to screw that up when it was kind of the elite and the privileged that got to go to college, because, they just go back and work for their dad's firm or something like that. Nowadays, this is too life-changing. This is like, there's too many people that are first-generation students that are low income, and it costs too much money for us to screw it up. So we got to get it right.
First of all, by the way, I was going to say something polite when you talked about, I'm a nerd, I do a lot of obscure reading on weekends, and I was going to say, that's probably all of us in this room, and then you said I'm reading education journals from 1930s, and that's okay.
Yeah,
you're right.
I try to get to the next level, of nerdiness. What am I going to do?
But I think this point about language as being key to equity, and our ability to make sure that education is more equitable. And is not just for those who know that language and who have the secret code that they can communicate to, to employers who also knew that language, but it's something that's available to everyone, is so important. Jamie, on that note, you've talked about the core values of higher education. And the importance of those values being respected, both in language and otherwise. I'm wondering if you can talk through some of the potential pitfalls here, and how we make sure that those core values stay respected as we embark on this.
I think the work that Michael and Ray were talking about will accomplish that, because the more we do that kind of analysis and scoping, I think we will find that they reiterate, that they summarize the very central competencies that higher education talks about, and that you get in the better done surveys about what employers are looking for also. One thing it would help us do is take the mystery out of it, because students who are trying to determine increasingly, does college have value? And if so, what value? And how will I know if I'm getting it? That having a common language reiterated between work and the academy will make it more commonsensical, that we are actually talking about the same things, and that's what makes for ability. In a little different context, years ago when I ran a public interest legal organization, the young lawyers came to us and said, we want to know what the pathway is to get to be as good as the senior managing attorneys that they were working for. What happens in those 20 years between now and then that makes them able to do what we find so impressive? And we said, well, let's go to the law schools and they'll be able to tell us what the first steps on that journey are, and then we can play out the rest of that pathway for the work that's done after graduation. Turned out they didn't have any, and that our creation of a list for a 20-person legal organization has become part of the core knowledge of people working in the legal profession about what it is you should have and how much of it you should get in school and how much of it you should get later. And the work that these people are describing is actually the larger project nationally for the same thing. I worked on the College Scorecard project, and one of the things that we are missing are ways to measure what happens later. Just really briefly, we can measure repayment of loans, we can measure income, maybe we'll be able to measure it by program, we can measure graduation, but we don't yet have ways to say, did I get what I came for? Do I have the things that you told me were important and that I now realize are important? And this kind of work could help us get there and make everybody, align people to be working toward the same ends.
That's fabulous, and Reg, just hoping you can bring this all together. What happens as you see it when these worlds come together, when these languages come together? Where do we get to?
Yeah, so the first thing is that students have a realistic expectation of what's out there in the workforce and what employers are looking for. And like you said, it's not about that first job, although studies show that the first job out of college is somewhat important, that you have a job that requires a college degree, or else your 10-year trajectory is not great. But have a realistic expectation of what jobs are out there, what they pay, and what the skills are needed for, but through the lens of, because if I take this job, then these are the areas in which I could traverse a future for myself later. So first thing is a realistic expectation of what it's like when I leave school. The second is all about the faculty having the information, a new set of information to help them think about the way that they're teaching their classes, and really helping students understand that these skills can be practiced in the classroom, and we can practice these things while we're learning, and that they can build upon each other, and that we can continue to add this to our personal inventory of skills, whether I put it through LinkedIn or just keep it for myself as my resume or whatever. And the final thing is to bridge the relationship between institutions and employers. And so through our data set, and the way that we visualize it is you can see all the employers around your college and institution that you may not have even known were there. So you can actually see who are all the people who are hiring the students in my area, what do they do, what kind of jobs are they looking for, what kind of skills are they looking for, and how do I help bring those people into my institution to build better relationships. So those are the three things that I think would happen.
I know we're over time, and I want to thank everybody for joining. I think hopefully you've taken away from this session the idea that the languages that seem so disparate are actually much, to quote your rearview mirror, are much closer than they appear. And this is, to quote Casey, something that we can all do. Thank you so much. Enjoyed the conversation.